Chapter 2. History of Languages. The language of God was the first language spoken upon the earth. Then as men became sinful in their lives, their language also became corrupted and foul. Wicked men could no longer speak a pure language. The first major catastrophe to the Adamic language occurred at the Tower of Babel. The government and people of Nimrod, the grandson of Ham, had turned from the teachings and truths of God. Even though the Lord had warned them to repent of their wickedness, they still persisted in their degraded and rebellious course. The great city of Babel was about to receive a curse which would afflict all mankind for many thousands of years. The confusion and dispersion of this great city caused the birth of a multitude of nations and languages. From amidst the great city of Babel were two noble men of God, Jared and his brother. Because of a special petition to heaven, the Lord had compassion upon Jared, therefore he did not confound the language of Jared and his brother and their friends and families. Ether 134, therefore, with one exception, the curse of confusion, scattering, and the loss of the pure language of God, fell upon all men. The pure language of God suffered first at the Tower of Babel because they turned away from God. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Gen. 11:9. This was one of the first curses of God upon mankind. And since this curse of confusion and scattering was caused by wickedness, it will require righteousness in the Spirit of God to bring men and their languages together again. That same being that destroyed the memory of the people at the building of the tower, so that they could not remember their own mother tongue, and the same being that gave to them new languages and tongues, will operate again by his power to do away with this curse, for I consider it a curse, and the blessing will be as great and as extensive as the curse. In destroying it from the face of the earth. Orson Pratt, Masterful Discourses, page 498. Other nations and people have continued to suffer with language changes. One of the more recent changes was among the Lamanite, Indian, people. They did murder the chief judge of the land, and the people were divided one against another, and they did separate one from another into tribes, every man according to his family and his kindred and friends, and thus they did destroy the government of the land. And every tribe did appoint a chief or a leader over them, and thus they became tribes and leaders of tribes. 3 Nephi 7:3-4. The Indian nations exist today as tribes with a chief to rule each tribe. They suffered the curse of Babel with each tribe adopting a different language. Similarly, the whole world suffers, as multitudes of nations gather, as it were, at the Tower of Babel, the United Nations attempting to reach agreements in peace. With all of the interpreters, radio communication systems and policy makers, language is still a barrier, and peace has never been less secure. Theologians of all denominations have studied the problem of glossolalia, but have been able to contribute little or nothing for its solution. Languages and dialects have continually been a barrier between people and nations. In a few instances, these barriers provide the means of detecting an enemy or a friend. One of these lamentable circumstances happened at the River Jordan. It occurred through the inability of the Ephraimites to pronounce the Hebrew word shibboleth, a stream. This language and dialect barrier was the reason for 42,000 of the Ephraimites to lose their lives. And the Gileadites took the passages of Jordan before the Ephraimites. And it was so, that when those Ephraimites which were escaped said, Let me go over, that the men of Gilead said unto him, Art thou an Ephraimite? If he said, Nay, then said they unto him, Say now Shibboleth, and he said Sibboleth. For he could not frame to pronounce it right. Then they took him, and slew him at the passages of Jordan. And there fell at that time of the Ephraimites 42,000. Judges 12:5-6. The curse of Babel has reached proportions of over 3,000 different languages upon the earth today. Many nations have desired that their own native tongue become a universal language. However, this has only caused jealousies and barriers and inevitable failure. Artificial languages have been created with the hope that they would become a universal means of communication between nations. Through the years, more than 600 languages have been created for this purpose, meeting with little success. The most successful, the Esperanto language, was developed by a Polish man who published his first Esperanto book in 1887. Today there are nearly 8 million people who speak or read this language, but it is not meeting with the success for which it was created. The difficulty of establishing one common language was explained in an interesting editorial entitled Other Tongues. Mankind has long desired the establishment of a universal language, by means of which nations could understand each other, without the necessity of spending so much time in the study of foreign tongues. The diversity of speech existing at present is frequently referred to as the curse of Babel. Many serious attempts have been made to construct an artificial language and to secure its adoption by the world in general. The nations today are in constant communication with one another, and a common medium of speech would seem to be in every way desirable. Perhaps the most important effect of the kind was that which resulted in the publication of the Volapük, a so-called language, in fact rather a skeleton plan for a language, arranged upon the simplest and most consistent rules of grammar and construction as understood by men. The great obstacle in the way of adopting such a man-made speech is the fact that it possesses no literature of its own, it is newly born, and with no history, while one of the chief incentives to the study of foreign language is the hope of reaching the written treasures of the nations with whom that language is common. There appears to be little promise that the confusion of tongues will be removed in any such way as that proposed. At the present time, English, German, and French are the most widely used of the modern classical tongues, and a person possessing a reading and speaking knowledge of these may make his way with but little difficulty among all civilized nations. In this connection, it should be remembered by the Latter-day Saints that perhaps no other people have better reason than have we for pursuing the study of foreign languages. We ought to be distinguished for our ability as linguists. Our communities consist of representatives from many countries, and the sure word of prophecy teaches us that this composite condition will continue and increase amongst us. Many of our people are versed in other tongues than the English. Some of them have come here while entirely ignorant of the common language of our country, and in their laudable efforts to acquire our speech, they often neglect their own. It would be easy for them to give their children a knowledge of the language which is so familiar to themselves. Linguistic ability is in demand, it has indeed an actual money value, but an incentive to such study greater by far than any hope of pecuniary gain exists among the Latter-day Saints. The cause of God has need of worthy men and women versed in the languages of the world, men who can go abroad and carry the message of salvation into the houses of those who know not our speech. Yet in common with our fellow Americans, we are behind many of the other nations in our devotion to the study of languages. Juv. Inster. 3214, March 15, 1898. The variety of languages on the earth is the result of wickedness, so the question now is, will the earth ever receive a common language among the nations? The Apostle Orson Pratt spoke on the subject and explained the promise of a universal language. Let us now compare our present means of obtaining knowledge with the facilities which are, no doubt, in store for the people of God. Will there be a pure language restored? There will, through the testimony of the prophets. We are also told that tongues shall cease. We are to understand by this that the great varieties of languages and tongues that have existed on the earth for many ages are to be done away, they are to cease. Now something must take the place of those imperfect, confused languages and tongues. What is that something? It is a language that is spoken by higher orders of beings than ourselves, that is, beings that have progressed further than ourselves. It is that same language that was spoken for nearly 2,000 years after the creation, that was spoken by Adam and by his children, from generation to generation that came down to the flood, and was taught extensively among the children of Noah until the Lord by a direct miracle caused the people to forget their own mother tongue, and gave them a variety of new tongues that they had no knowledge of, and by this means scattered them abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And now that same being that destroyed the memory of the people at the building of the tower, so that they could not remember their own mother tongue, and the same being that gave to them new languages and tongues, will operate again by his power to do away this curse, for I consider it a curse, and the blessing will be as great and as extensive as the curse, in destroying it from the face of the earth. Orson Pratt, JD 3100. The promise has been made by the Lord that someday we would have a common language and a peaceful earth. Now we shall look at the evidences of that promise being fulfilled, and how man will be able to achieve that blessed condition.